team for leading us in worship this morning. So I want to, as usual, start off with a question. How should Christians think about human government? I think in my entire life, over the last few years, this has been the time that I've heard Christians talk about government more than I have for the decade before that, for as long as I've been a Christian. For the first couple of years, no one was really talking about the relationship between governing or human authorities and faith. Like, we would think of it as like a secondary, tertiary issue that we would look into, be like, aha, okay, good enough. And then we'd kind of move on to something else. But in the last maybe 5, 6 or so years, it's been quite a hot topic among conservative Christians. And this question is only heating up in the context of among Christians today. I think for me, when I noticed that it started to take off was actually during the pandemic, during the lockdown, because Christians started to ask questions as they were entering month into the pandemic, being at home, sitting there, and they're probably asking questions like this. What role and rights do the government really have in overseeing my life? How should we as Christians submit to the government, and when should we reject it? Does human government have any validity in a Christian's life? Now, these are, I think, natural questions, right? I think that during the pandemic, when you're being locked down, you're not thinking about submission. You're thinking about, how do I get out of this situation of being locked down? How do I do my own thing? How do I gain the freedom back that I lost during this lockdown? And you're wondering, what is the wiggle room here I have about actually obeying the government or not obeying the government? And then from that, people start to read a lot about, thinking a lot about, what does the Bible actually say about government? And I think that if you were to do a search on Google or to go on YouTube today, you would find hundreds of videos on the topic of church and government, I think since the beginning of the pandemic that we've seen. But I think it's, again, a natural question that we should all have as Christians. Because if God is our king, how do we live in a world that's governed by earthly people, especially people who probably care little about the things of God? Now, this morning, as we talk about this topic, we're probably not going to go into very deep depth about what this actual meaning or how to address this question. But I do think that here, Jesus does give us some helpful considerations about our responsibility to the government, and then he's going to use this to transform what is our responsibility to God himself. And I think that this is kind of realized or kind of seen in the main idea of today's passage in the final section where it says, give Caesar what is Caesar's, and to give to God what is God's. Now, in the story, we're going to find this kind of unlikely alliance between the Pharisees and Herodians. But before that, let's kind of move backward in time. At this point of time, Israel has been conquered by Rome for the last 90 years, and Rome has ruled over Israel, probably in one way or another, over this period of time. Now, Israel's political landscape completely changed after the Romans came in, and it really revolved around how do we, as the political leaders of political leaders of Israel, relate to these conquering people, the Romans themselves. And so you had different factions and parties that came out of that. I think you have people like the Herodians, a political party, who are clearly willing to work with Rome, and they support Roman leaders like Herod Antipas, who was a Roman leader. You have people on the other side, like Pharisees and even Sadducees, who do not want to cooperate with Rome because they saw that Rome was these Gentile sinners who had conquered the land of Israel. They didn't follow God's laws. They desecrated the temple. And they saw that anyone who yielded to Roman rule as someone who chose allegiance to Rome over allegiance to God. And so we can see that even among parties here, there's this deep dislike of each other, but they're still willing to collaborate against Jesus because they disliked him more than that. To the Pharisees, Jesus was someone who put their religious authority at risk. As we continue to see throughout the Gospel of Mark, as Jesus interacts with the Pharisees and Sadducees and the religious elite in Israel, he continually shows that their authority is really tradition and not from the scriptures themselves, but they're also that Jesus has greater authority than they do, and they feel threatened by what he is doing, by who he is, by the authority that he has. And they constantly, even as we saw last week, are asking, where does your authority come from that you can say and do the things that you do? And so they're threatened by who he is and the power that he has. On the other end, for the Herodians, they are also threatened by Jesus because they're afraid that as Jesus becomes more and more powerful, their political power is now in danger. And so together, they work together and collaborate, and they come to Jesus with what seems like this impossible question that they are to answer. And it's this question: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? Now, the Pharisees and Herodians do something really sneaky, right? I think if anybody who's tried to play these word games and they're trying to trap people, it's somehow, it always starts with the same way. It always starts with flattery, right? You flatter the person, right? You're so good, you're so great, you're a third party, you are objective in your decision making. This is the way in which they speak to Jesus, to butter him up, to kind of make him feel good about himself, that he feels like this question is not that big of a deal. But really what they're trying to do here is this is part of the trap, that they're trying to lull him into a false sense of security, that he gives a poor answer to the question. Because the question they pose is one that has explosive results depending on how you answer them. In fact, I bet even at your Christmas dinner this year, these are probably topics that you probably avoided. If you met with your larger family, people from probably different parts of the world, maybe people who are maybe within Toronto, but you have different belief systems, these are probably two topics that you probably avoided at Christmas dinner this year: the topic of religion and the topic of politics. Because we know that if you ever talk about these things at a family dinner, it can be quite scary about the outcome that they have. I remember being in a dinner, and I made a passing remark about an American war to some patriotic Americans, and I was not ready for the firepower that was coming back my way. That they took an offense that I would even bring up this question about this war that was happening, that there's no way that could be seen as wrong. How dare you question the political powers that were at B? And I thought my position was quite nuanced. I could accept certain things, but there were certain areas that I didn't agree with. But yet even that was not enough, and I was in for quite an earful from the people that were around me. And so clearly we can see that these kind of topics, religion and politics, have powerful effects upon who hears them. And it's actually these two topics here that the Jewish elites are targeting or speaking about when they ask this question. Because no matter how Jesus answers this question, Jesus' life will be put in danger. If Jesus is one who just plays this game of trying to cater to the best group, there really is no way that he could answer this question. Because if Jesus says, no, it is not lawful for the Israelites to give to Caesar, certainly this would make the Jewish people happy, but Rome would see this as an attack on their government, and this would put his life in the crosshairs against the governing authorities. If Jesus says yes, that it is lawful for the Israelites, then it would make the crowd that would turn against them, removing any authority that he has over them. And so either way, whether he answers yes or he answers no, the Pharisees and the Herodians get what they want. It's an impossible question. Now, I'm someone who loves to play word games too. I like the fun of it. Certainly in a past life, I'd love to play them more. And so I kind of understand really deeply what this question is. It's kind of like if someone were to ask you the question about, do you know that you're dumb? Right? Because no matter how you answer that question, you're going to look like you are dumb. Or you could say, no, I didn't know that I'm dumb. Right? You still look dumb. You can also say, yes, I know that I'm dumb. Then why are you so dumb? Right? No matter how you answer this question, you're going to look foolish to the person who asked this question. And this is the same with Jesus here, that Jesus cannot answer this question without trouble with the crowd or danger from the state. But here Jesus gives probably the only perfect answer he possibly can give. And so he starts by asking for this denarius, or this coin, to show them something. Now, the denarius is the value of a laborer's wage for a laborer's day of work, but it's also the coin that you use to pay this poll tax in which they're referring to. And on the screen here is a depiction of that coin which they were to hand to the tax collectors for this tax. Now, on the front side of the face side of this coin, we see the face of Tiberius, or Caesar himself. And in it, there is an inscription on both sides. And the inscription says this. It says, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. And on the back side of the coin, it says chief priest. So Jesus asked them, when you look at this coin, especially the front side with the picture, whose likeness and inscription is this? And so the only thing that they could say is that clearly this is Caesar's image. And so this prompts Jesus to then say, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. This is a brilliant answer. Because what he's saying is these are Caesar's coins. He had minted them with this picture of himself. He inscribed them, and when paying the taxes, all you're doing is you're returning to him what is his. And no one could find fault with Jesus' words, because Jesus doesn't connect this to politics or to religion. Rather, he connects it to about ownership. Because who could be giving? Who could object to giving to Caesar what is already his? And so this is the way that Jesus answers this question. Now, I think that this idea, or what Jesus says here, has deep meaning for us this morning as we look about what exactly does Jesus mean by these words. And I wanted to delve a little bit deeper upon this topic about what does Jesus mean by rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to give to God the things that are God. Beginning with the first part about giving to Caesar what is his, Jesus tells us or speaks to us about, he validates the Roman government and basically human governments in general, starting and by stating that the submission to earthly government is not out of line with submission to God. That even if this person, like Tiberius himself, sees himself as a god, it is still a valid government that God's people are to submit to. And the reason why he thinks this is because of the question, because of how the scripture sees what God is doing in the world, that he sees that these governing officials, regardless of whether they are unbelievers or not, whether they see themselves as a god or not, are still servants of God, and they exist because they are given authority instituted by God himself. And we know this because Paul takes what said here about rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's, and he writes a brief commentary, or he commentates on this passage in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, where he says, let every person then, this is Paul speaking, be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. This is a very powerful statement, right? And if you look at Israel, as I've looked at, as far as I can tell, there's no statement that's quite like that, because a lot of the Old Testament revolves around a theocratic state that Israel creates. And how it relates to other governments is not altogether clear. We see glimpses that Israelites can work in a foreign government, like with Daniel, but it's not as clearly spelled out. But here in the New Covenant, it is clearly spelled out that we see all of these governing authorities in the world, some good, some bad, but all of them are at some level servants of God, and all of them have their authority because it comes from God himself. And I think God does so because in the hierarchy of God's thinking, it is better that we live lawfully than to live in anarchy or chaos. When Paul speaks of this idea of government, he now speaks of it that the government not only has the ability to tax us as people, but within its limit, it can require behavior of God's people. And Christians are bound to obey our governing bodies, not because of the state's power or its authority to do so, but because God compels us to do so. It means that we are all to abide by the law, whether it's taxes or traffic law or criminal law. We are radically called to obey what the law requires, even to respect and pray for our leaders, even ones we don't like. And we can do so because of the way we think about God. We think of our God not just one who just is kind of not interfering into the world, or he just knows the world's affairs, but we can do so because God himself is in control of all things. He is the one who's ultimately in control of what's happening in the world, and nothing escapes his grasp. So even these leaders who think that they're outside of God's grasp, God is still within control of these leaders. So for us as Christians, what we are to do is to render to government what belongs to them, which is to obey or submit to these governing authorities. And this is part of the way in which we worship this morning. David Platt, one of the pastors that I really enjoy, made this comical remark that he says that we should look that on April 30th, which is the last day that you can give your taxes, as a day of worship for all of us. It's a weird thing to say, right? Like it's just like thinking about April 30th as a day that we can worship. But in one sense, he's very right? That when we actually submit to the government, we do what we are called to do. We are actually worshiping God, that we are giving finances to the government, what they deem that we owe. And this is actually an act of worship because we are doing so to please God. And so as we submit to the government, as we do what it requires in the way that they are limited to, this is all pleasing and worshipful to God and what they are owed as God has told us. Now, I also want to be clear here that this doesn't mean that we are to mindlessly follow governments no matter what. But it does mean that we are thoughtfully, continually thinking about what honor or glorifies God. And I think most of the time, I think it's about submission to government. This should be the normative way in which we should think. But there are times that we may have to resist. For instance, we're told to disobey God. If we're told to resist in pleasing God, then we must resist. But I would say that our disposition is to submit rather than to rebel. And I think that our issue as people is that we love rebellion, whether it's to God or whether it's to government. This is certainly true of Israel, as we see the history of the nation of Israel as one of rebellion. This tax, in fact, is actually one in which is actually a big example of rebellion. Originally, this poll tax was instituted in 6 AD, and shortly after this tax was instituted, Israel had a giant revolt in the nation because of this tax that was put in place. And later on, in about 30 years or 40 years after the events of what's happening here, Israel will revolt again. That will be inspired by the first revolt in 6 AD that will lead to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. But it's not just Israel that has this problem of rebellion. It's us as well. I have this issue as well. When I have conversations, or as I hear our government speak or talk, or as I go online, maybe as we may get tickets that we don't think we deserve, or we have taxes that we think that are too insane or too crazy, we often feel a need to criticize or wanting to rebel against the government. I think we also saw this during the lockdown, right? We saw lots of churches, I think, have a heart that they wanted to push against what the government wanted. Now, I want to be very careful here because there is a question about where is the line, but I suspect that, and maybe that for many of them, there's just this heart that they want to push against the government. They want to rebel. They want to make a show of what's about to happen. And I think that that's like us too. You might find that you might be at work and your coworkers start to make jokes about the government. It's like, oh, these officials, they're just dummies that are up there. They're really not doing anything. Or when people watch in government officials being embarrassed or humiliated online, that people can see that the society is being run poorly, or the culture is getting worse, or that the crime seems so heinous, our hearts oftentimes want to be very defiant towards government because we don't think it's working. And instead of praying or respecting the governments we have, even as inept as they may be, we instead mock and disrespect the governing authorities that are in place. Now, this isn't to say, again, that there isn't a place for healthy criticism, but I would say that oftentimes where it should be done with charity and love and concern, it's actually done with sarcasm and joking and belittling of other people. And so I think that we also need to be careful of our hearts as well, that we have this tendency, whether we are Jew or Gentile, or we're whatever we may be to this morning, that we desire to rebel against this government. And I think we have lots of great examples of what healthy relationship to government should look like, or even healthy rebellion should look like, I think. I think starting in the scriptures, I think that we can see as Paul and as the apostles go into the world, they are affected by evil governments that want to stop them from preaching the gospel. And yet they want to the best to obey the governing authorities, and they do so even to the point of their life. But where there's a point in which they are called to stop preaching, to stop doing what God has called them to do, they say, no, I can't do that because God is greater. I need to please God. I can't please men. And so there's a healthy way in which we can see that this is good. I think another example for me is the Reformation. The Reformation was a time in which the Protestant church split from the Catholic Church. And it wasn't just because we had a heart that we wanted to rebel. It's because we come to these deep truths of the Scriptures, like the five solas, like Scripture alone, Christ alone, faith alone, grace alone, glory alone. And our first inclination, or their first inclination, was not that we want to split from the church. We want to do our own church plant, like sometimes we see today. No, they wanted to stay within the Catholic Church, to reform the church from within. And it's only until they couldn't any longer that they had to separate themselves from the church. But secondly, the attitude of these reformers at the Reformation was not one of triumph or one of where they felt like they were doing a great thing. They're doing great things about like just disobeying the government or civil authorities. It was often one of sorrow. It was often one of sadness because they didn't want to split. These are the right ways in which we have seen from Scripture and from our own Christian history of how we and should rightfully rebel when those times come. And so I pray that as we think about this question about submitting to the government or rendering to Caesar or giving to the government what they belong, that this would be our heart this morning, that our general disposition would be to submit rather than to rebel. And when we have to rebel, we do so in the way the Scripture shows us, lovingly, caringly, with concern, with sorrow, not triumph. So that's the first one. Now the second part is about rendering to God what is God's. And I think that for me, when I first read this passage, my question was, how do these two ideas connect? Right? Because you could argue that maybe Jesus is saying this because he's just kind of making a shot. It's like, hey, it's just a chance to plug God, so I'm going to do that, right? So I'm just going to talk about government. Let's just pull it back to God no matter what it's going to take. And at first, I'd always thought that this was what God was, or what Jesus was doing in this passage, that rendering to God, rendering Caesar what is Caesar's, and then he just makes a plug about rendering to God what is God's. And there actually is no connection between these two ideas. But I actually think that there is a connection between these two ideas that certainly I did not see when I first read this passage. And I think it's worth considering and thinking about right now, if you could take a moment, to ask, how does Jesus connect rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and rendering to God the things that are God's? How do these two ideas connect with one another? Just take a moment to think about that. I think the answer to how they connect is in the likeness and image idea. Jesus ascribes ownership of the coin by the image that was on the coin. And now Jesus applies that to people as he applies this to all of us, as we were all made in God's image and likeness. And so we need to render what is God's because we are made in God's image and we belong to him, just as these coins belong to Caesar. Elisa this morning read for us Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, that tells us how men and women were fashioned at the beginning of time. And I'm going to read it to you one more time. It says, verse 26, "Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. In this Genesis account, we have the explanation of how we were made and what we were made for, what it means to be human. And is that all of us, whether we are believer or unbeliever, or people of all time, were made in the image of God. And it's not just speaking of what they do, certainly does talk about this idea of dominion. It's actually speaking about who they are. What is the being, the ontology of what a person is, not just what the function of what a person does. And this has always been the case since the beginning of all time, that man was to bears God's image. And this is how we are connected to this passage today, Because we are all image bearers, we are now to render upon our lives unto God because we bear his image. Now, there are two major things I think this is going to be at play for us today as we think of what it means to be image bearers. Firstly, it means that all of us belong to God, not to Caesar. In the ancient world, when they looked at their subject, they saw them as plebs, they saw people as almost as their ownership, pawns that they can use to fulfill their political aspirations. But this is not true of God. God does not see us as pawns, but rather he sees us as a family of God, as sons of God. When we look at this idea of image bearing or people bearing the nature of God, we see this in the Old Testament, but we see it in the context of like people having sons, and then they would say that, hey, this person is in the image of their father, and it's not related to God. So I'll give you an example here. Seth and Adam, in Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, Seth is the son of Adam. He is a son in his own likeness, in his own image. And this comes up a number of times in Genesis to say that sons become the image of the Father. And so when it says you and I are made in God's image, it means something about our sonship to God. It means from far from being lowly or from being alone or having no purpose or meaning or being in this world or being lowly under Caesar, we are actually part of a family of God. We have belonging and that we are precious to him. Secondly, that being made in the image of God means worship is the call of our life. Worship of God in our life and not worship of Caesar. Remember on the coin that we saw a little bit earlier, I'm going to go back to the coin. On the backside of this coin, that is not the face, it says chief priest. And the reason why it says chief priest is because that Tiberius or any of the emperors are the chief priest of the imperial cult of Rome. It is a cult of Rome in which worships the emperor as a divine person. And so they saw themselves as people of Rome, as subjects under this divine person. But we as Christians are not made in Caesar's image. We are not part of the cult of the Roman imperial worship. Rather, we are people who are made in God's image, and our worship belongs to God alone. It means that all of our life belongs to God to worship him. It means that we worship him by how we connect with God, that we praise and honor his name. We worship in the things that we think and the ways that we feel and the ways that we behave in the world around us, because being made in God's image means that we represent him in the world around us. A second idea, this idea of image bearing, is representation of God. And a great example of that is the statue. Now, the only major statue that I can think of in my own life is the Ryerson statue, or Egerton Ryerson. I don't know if it's still there anymore because I think the name has changed, so I don't know if they tore down the statue. But at what point of time, Ryerson had the statue of its original founder, Egerton Ryerson, right in the middle of the campus. And the idea is that the likeness or person or representation of who this person was represented in the middle of the campus, probably as a reminder that this was the end goal. Now, I think that what's happened is that a lot of people don't want to be like Ryerson anymore, so they've removed his name from the campus. But the idea still stands that when you put up a statue, the idea is a representation of the person that you're looking towards and looking at, what he is like, and oftentimes it depicts something about what they were about. This is how we represent God in the world, that we are a portrayal of who God actually is. And so you and I are representations of all creation. This is how we worship God with all of our life. Now, I want us to also realize that getting to live and to act out or to live out what it means to be made in God's image is only possible because of Jesus. Now, we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, we saw that you and I were made in God's image. But something happened at the fall. And I think that, at least for myself, this has been a really exciting topic to think about, talk about, or to read about, because there's been a lot of discussion, development on this topic. But something has gone wrong when the fall happens about the way in which you and I can no longer bear God's image as we rightfully should. Right? Some people talk about being lost, or talk about being broken, talk about being abandoned. Where that you and I were originally meant to be a family of God, to have sonship, to have this kind of life that we should live to worship God. That is the way that we were originally made. At the fall, both of these things get broken, that the relationship between God and man gets severed, not because of God, but because of us. And the way in which we live no longer is to worship God, but oftentimes is to worship ourselves. And so something has gone horribly wrong in the way we as mankind should be bearing God's image in the world. And yet, Jesus here is the one who fixes this problem with our image. First, Jesus is the perfect representation of the image of God. As it says in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And so he is the image of what we are to be like, of how we are to worship, of how we are to praise God in the world. And so we, as God's people, as we put our faith in Jesus Christ and believe upon the saving work and have the Holy Spirit work in our lives, transform us, we now take on this image through Jesus Christ. Because we often talk about as Christians that we are to be like Jesus, but Jesus is the image of God. So therefore, being like Jesus is us being in the image of God once more. And so it is not anything apart from Christ that we could have this image. In fact, we need Christ to bear the image of God as we speak about. And so we can't actually render to God what belongs to God until we have gone through the road through Jesus. And so Jesus is a very important part of the process of us rendering to God what is God's. But here comes my final reflection for today. And maybe the one that's going to take the longest to come to terms with is, does it really show in our lives that we truly have been minted in God's image? The minting process in building these coins often was they would take some silver and there would be kind of like this indent, and they would hit the indent, they would hit the coin on this indent, and they would paste the face on the coin. And so you can clearly see that this has been an indented coin. You can see the image that is going to be on there. When people look at you, do they see that same imprint? Do they see that same image? Do they see that same minting in your life? As many of you know, I have 2 kids. I have a daughter named Constance and a son named Phineas. And I think when they were really young, it was really hard to tell they were my kids because they're both really good looking. So it was kind of like this contrast between beauty and beast. But as they were getting older, you could start to clearly see that the 2 of them and I are related. Number one, all of you guys keep telling me that Phineas looks like me. I don't see it. This is what you say. But secondly, I can clearly see that my kids are just like me. Sometimes in the best way, sometimes in the worst way. They are like me in that they are super silly for no reason. There's no reason why they should be that silly in their life, and yet they are. They are like me because they have a cleverness in this world that is useless in the school or real world things, but it kind of shows itself in the way they perceive and see the world. And oftentimes as they make perceptions or they act in their silliness or they act in their cleverness, I'm like, I have come to this exact same conclusion as you. And so I can see my likeness, my genetic personality, about who I am, in Constance and Phineas, and I'm sure Hannah can do that as well, who is my wife, that clearly we can see that we share something in common that is more than just our surroundings, but there's something deeper that we share as one people, as kind of people who share of this kind of common makeup. Do we have that same sharing and likeness to Christ? Because this is who we are today. When people see your life, do they see and they see the way you live and the way that you behave, and they talk to you and they hear your thoughts, do they get a sense of who you belong to or who you represent in this world today? Because people should. Worship to God, they should be able to see the worship of God in your daily life, the way you praise and adore Him. They should see the righteousness that Christ has in your life, not because you are perfect, but because you have a genuine desire to live the right life, to live the life that God has given you, to be like Him. When people talk to you, do they hear the wisdom of Christ in your words, the love and servanthood of Christ in your actions? Because this is who you are. Is this the image that we bear in the world? This is the relationship that we have with God in our personal time with Him. Because this is what it should be. These are the things that we are to render to God and give to Him. These are the things that we're called to in the way in which we relate to Him horizontally and how we relate to one another. Vertically, and then how we relate to each other horizontally. Is God's image clear to those around you, that you bear His image, that you are like Him, that there is something of you that is unlike the rest of the world? And that when you talk and speak, you see Christ in your words, Christ in your actions, Christ in your wisdom, Christ in your thinking, Christ in your emotions. Because this is what we are to give unto God. And if we don't, the question is, have we really been minted? Or are we just kind of like this blank silver coin that has no image, that has no greater calling, has no greater purpose? My worry, not just for you, but for myself, is that at the end of time, what I'll find is what's actually minted on the coin of who I am is actually the image of myself. Because that means I'm still dead in my sin, and I still need Christ to save me. So whose image do you actually bear into the world today? What image are you actually minted in? Let me conclude here. I hope this passage makes very clear the calling that we have this morning. Firstly, that we must honor both earthly governments and God, and that even if the government does wicked things, we are still to submit to them and to respect and to pray for them, because God's given them a specific place of authority, and also they have been given authority by God. But we also need to realize that the government is not our God, that we don't live just mindlessly or brainlessly and follow after them, but ultimately our allegiance is to God. And so as we follow the government, it really is an act of pleasing God. And so we need to get our priorities straight about what actually we should be doing and what is the triage or the hierarchy of what matters in this submission. And then lastly is to then now act. And it's to do what Jesus told us to do, which is to render to Caesar, or to give to government what is owed to them, and to give to God, or render to God what is owed to Him. And my deep, sincere hope this week is, as we go out into the world again, as we go out from today, that we spend some time thinking about whose image do we actually bear. Thank you. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up and to sing our response song together.